screaming in the woods. The American dream is different for everyone. For some, it's to be successful and live in a big house on some hill in California. Mine is simple, albeit a bit stereotypical. My dream is to live in the suburbs and live a quiet life with my family in a small neighborhood. Our house lies just on the outskirts of a town, and our street is full of pleasant people. My family and I easily become friends with everyone on our street once we moved. Our house was in front of a dense forest full of green trees. It was a beautiful scene that fit my dream perfectly. The first week of living at our new house was wonderful. We had just installed a new electric fence so that our dog Smokey could run and play with the kids outside. Sometimes the kids would run with the dog into the woods and play fetch by throwing sticks and watch Smokey try to weave through all of the brush and broken branches. I always told them to never go too far into the woods or they'd get lost. The 8th day of living in our new home was strange. Much to my dismay, the kids ran outside with the dog and tried running into the woods. But Smokey stopped just outside of them, refusing to go any further. He was terrified, and he let out a small whimper out as he slowly backed away from the forest. The kids pulled on Smokey's collar, but he wouldn't budge, and the more they tugged on him, the more he resisted. So the kids ditched the dog and went into the woods. I approached Smokey to see what was wrong. I knelt down next to him and scanned the woods in the direction he appeared to be looking at, but as far as I can tell, there was nothing. As the day progressed, I called the kids inside because it was getting late and sent them to bed with a few bedtime stories. After I went to bed with my wife and wrapped my arms around her as we drifted off to sleep, it was nearly 2 in the morning when I woke up due to a somewhat sickening sound. I got up out of bed and walked downstairs, where the noise was even louder. It sounded like a dying animal, and it was coming from the woods behind our house. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, and the screams sounded like whatever it was suffering a slow and excruciatingly painful death. The screams continued endlessly and were getting louder and louder, with every scream increasing in volume. They each sounded more sickening than the last. Suddenly, my heart sank, and a sense of dread washed over my body. The screaming had stopped abruptly. It was sad to think some poor animal was just finished off. However, I felt a great sense of relief. The screaming had been torture for me. Trying to forget what I'd heard, I shook my head and went back to bed. I woke up the next morning and I told my wife about the night before. She said it was probably just an animal and I shouldn't worry about it. It was about noon when I went outside to play with the kids and Smokey. I decided to accompany them into the woods, but once again Smokey stopped at the edge. This time he was barking intensely, and I decided to go see what was in there. I didn't see anything, and even looked around for traces of any kind of attack on the animal I heard last night. As I started walking back to the house, I told the kids not to go in the forest, but my wife protested. She claimed I had nothing to worry about and that I was just being paranoid. The following day, the older of my two sons, John, told me while he was running around and playing outside, he had heard what sounded like a child screaming in the woods. Strange, because the screams that I heard sounded nothing like a kid. Possibly an older man, but definitely more along the lines of an animal. 2 days later, Smokey disappeared. There were no traces of him, and no one had seen him since the night before. I started to get more and more worried due to the recent events happening. On the bright side, I hadn't heard screaming for the past few nights. I'd hoped that whatever it was gone. Around midnight, I woke up to the sight of my son, Mike, in front of my bed with a terrified look on his face. He asked if he could sleep in my room tonight, and so normally I asked him what was bothering him. He told me that when he woke up in the middle of the night, he saw a shadow out in the backyard of a child. However, he said the kid walked around like a dog and was on all fours. He had locked eyes with him through the window, and it bolted off into the woods, where later Mike heard screams. I told Mike that he could sleep in my room, so he would have nothing to worry about. That night I stayed awake all night and waited to hear anything, so I could find some answers. I began to doze off, when suddenly the silence was broken. The screams had started once more. I grabbed the shotgun and the flashlight from the garage and sprinted into the woods. As I got further into the woods, I could hear the screams getting louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and chills of pure dread were enveloping my entire body. As I got to what I thought about 20 feet from the screaming, it all just stopped. The sudden silence was a bit unnerving, and my heart began beating faster, if that was possible. With speed I didn't think I possessed, I ran back home. The more I ran, the more afraid I became. It was taking way too long to go back to the house. Maybe I was going the wrong way. I ran, and I could not find the edge of the woods. Suddenly I heard barking coming from behind me, and it was none other than, you guessed it, Smokey. I ran in his direction, yelling out for him, but I couldn't find him. Just when I thought I was getting closer, the barking stopped. I began to feel queasy and started running further and further until I stumbled upon what I'd call a pure monstrosity. It stood around my height. Its skin was so pale that it glowed in what little moonlight there was. It stood awkward, as if it had a hunchback, its body deformed and twisted. What got to me the most was its face, which so happened to be my face. Sort of. It was a deformed version of my face, to say the least. Its mouth was huge, with teeth that looked like they could grind metal, and it had so many tongues I didn't even bother trying to count. And its eyes, where the fuck were they? The thing then got on its hands and knees and began crawling towards me at an alarming pace. I dropped my gun in fear and bolted in the opposite direction, sprinting as fast as I could, trying to escape the woods. And that thing, I could hear its steps on my heels, and I let out a panicked scream, hoping someone would hear, only to have a breathtaking revelation. My heart sank to the pits of my stomach. My scream. I'd been hearing my own screams all along. This thing, I think it can mimic voices, if it can mimic my face. Although horribly, surely it can mimic my voice as well. Those screams my kids heard must have been their own, and the thing Mike saw was this thing, no doubt. All this dawned on me as I continued to run. I chanced a glance behind me, and I didn't see a thing, which in turn made my blood run cold. I was exhausted from the constant running, but a twig snapping in the distance had me running like never before. How long had it been since I'd been running anyway? Where was the edge of the woods? I just wanted to run back home and get my family out of here and away from that thing. Unfortunately, nothing looked familiar, and the more I continued to run, the more I realised I wouldn't be leaving these woods. In retrospect, I should have taken my own advice. Do not go far into the woods, otherwise you could get lost. The Walk, posted by Dependent Ad 87493. This was during fall of 2021. I was going for a walk to feel the fall breeze. I took walks every Tuesday and Thursday and Friday. I went on 1 hour walks, and some people find it unusual for guys to walk for 1 hour, but I did. So on Tuesday during October, I was going for a walk. My route was simple: left, right, etc. I took a right and saw some figure. I could see tints of red, so I continued walking and made a right. I got to the end of the road and turned around. I could see the figure again, but his hood was up. "You need something?" I said to the figure. He didn't respond, and kept following me as I walked. He followed me until I got to an entrance of a road, to a neighbourhood that reminds me of the back rooms. I had enough of this fucker following me. I turned around and yelled, "Look, buddy. Don't want you..." I was cut off by his appearance. He put his hood down, and it was a demented looking human. His eyes widened, and he lunged at me. I ran until I got to another neighbourhood near my house. I was out of breath. What the fuck was that thing? Why was he following me? I thought, and then I felt the feeling of being watched. It was normal, since everyone watches me as I walk, but this time I was paranoid. I continued to walk, and something beeped. I patted all around me, and I felt a bump. I grabbed it. It looked like it was removable, so I took it out of my head and looked at it. It was a tracker. I broke the thing as fast as I can, and after I did that, I heard pixelated mumbles, and I realised something. I was scared and continued to walk. I looked at the park that I pass every walk and saw red and green things pixelated. I was scared as fuck. Few minutes passed and I got back to the sidewalk near my neighbourhood. I was convinced no one was watching or following me until I heard, "Hey." I looked and it was the demented person. I backed up about to run when it yelled, "Run! Don't let her get you!" What? What do you mean? Just fucking run, damn it! I ran as fast as I can. I heard more running. I looked behind me and saw a scary, pixelated woman with red hair. I ran as fast as I could until I got to my house and slammed the door shut. After that, I took a shower and ate some dinner and tried to rationalize this situation. That demented person, was he trying to help me all this time? Why did he lunge at me then? Then I realized, the tracker. He lunged at me because of the tracker. I was relieved that he was trying to save me, and I calmed down and went to sleep. My walking days didn't end, however, but I was cautious every time I hear some kind of beep, because I can never know if it's that pixelated girl looking for me.
The Caveman. If someone is to read these bloodied parchments of mine, I sincerely hope that in finding these final sentiments, you yourself have not fallen into the same treacherous despair as I have. I deter anyone from investigating further, for I do not wish to be liable for anyone's psychological break and subsequent demise. I suppose context is necessary. I worked as an embalmer. I had always had an acute fascination with the dead. I suppose this originates from a life of indifference, which is to say that I had not longed for the human spirit. Such an occupation originally appealed to my Puritan ideals, viewing such bereaved ones as being of the utmost purity, comparable to that of a newborn child. I confess I longed for something more. This desire was, perhaps, the spark in which I would be inducted into a process of social delineation. An inherently superfluous curiosity spurred by a singularity, a pale, archaic star. It was right around June, when an unidentified corpse had been uncovered from a nearby sewer tract. That night I recall a cascading downpour that seemed to span centuries, whereas on that night the sight that befell my gaze in the morgue was one that I had not seen before. Yes, for this was the particular moment when a morbid intrigue took hold of me. A beached carcass washed up from the impervious deep of the great blue. It was the kind of sight that left one disconcerted without reason. The very thing that eroded my self-agency, which had previously comforted me in my endeavours. I felt my curiosity at this moment could not be satiated. Even if I were to scour every inch of the cavernous sewers in which it originated, one can infer that the man, for he was discernibly male, that lay in front of me had once been an intimidating figure. His frame was quite large, not to the extent of, say, a bodybuilder, but possessing the general physique that was proportionate to his bulking 6 feet 8 inch build. He sported oily undulating locks of black hair as well as a dense and unkempt beard that had been ravaged by vermin, complementing his pallid and immovable countenance, of which he seemed to be in a nocturnal slumber. Muscular atrophy had extended itself to each bilateral muscle, being most outwardly predominant in the pectoral and dorsal muscles. A sporadic rot had sullied every inch of his corpse, with multiple abrasions lining his body. His skin took on a fetid, repulsive quality. Any embalming fluid seemed futile in this stage of decomposition, left in the wake of arrant abhorrence. What was left of his graveless face may indicate a man who had monstrous deformities, one that can be said to be similar in its elongated and retarding form to that of a Neanderthal. The identifiable characteristics of this man had inevitably become indiscernible amidst the bile and grot that had accumulated onto his rotting flesh, accentuating his protruding features as if he had lived the remainder of his days in a forlorn mould of himself, irreversible from years of living as a troglodyte. I stared into his lost, wistful gaze, hoping to find some sign of humanity. I was met with anything but. Bereft of anything at all humane, what stared back was a creature of pure carnality. It felt as if he followed every move with a reserved judgment, for I was to him but another feeble observer. He seemed to be a relic of an era long gone, some kind of artifact that had been confounded by modernity. His body had so deeply engrossed itself in its own sickness that the burden of such lonely ideals seemed to tame in comparison. I saw in those very moments a symbolic gesturing of the prescient for a decadence in which I wasn't entirely sure he had any connection to. This man felt like an unseen pariah of an otherworldly form, one who coddled with the impossibilities of human nature, of what man had been capable of. Looking at the stillness of his body made me uneasy. I felt there was something innate inside him, as if he would awake from his slumber and tear you limb from limb. I fell into deep rumination, imagining how the everyday man would react to such a sight. Would it create a paradox in their mind, feeling both pity and contempt for adhering to such contrarianism seemed laughable, but doing this may reaffirm themselves in their insipid occupations, postulating their narrative of a presupposed world in which they would find it easy to understand, though I suppose I was no better, feeling as if to contradict these feelings would be defying my existence. I left later that night, feeling uncomfortable and afraid. An uncanny fear had clouded my sensibility. I remember feeling uneasy when returning to my apartment. I went to bed in order to be granted solitude from my night of turmoil in the vilifying, tempestuous heat of night. I had a feverish nightmare in this state of quasi-lucidity. I recall a sense of imbalance my gait that of a drunkard. I found myself in a place unknown to me, an abyssal pocket deep below the earth. Interconnected cavities led deeper into the dark underbelly of the cave. I had found myself within. Stalagmites lined the ceiling, like sharp stakes that threatened to impale me. I wandered aimlessly, guided by unchiseled pillars and mounds of rock. I carefully manoeuvred my way about the cave as to avoid falling into the transient and the perpetual darkness, lost in the absence of form. As I counted my steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, I heard it. Quick, heavy footsteps suddenly became audible, shaking the confines of the cave. I became paralyzed. I stood motionless, sitting and staring into the ferocious black in a state of terror, fearing what dreaded creature so swiftly moved towards me. It was in that dreaded stupor that I ran. I stumbled and fell, colliding with pebbles and stones that further heightened my sense of urgency, anticipating and preparing to submit to a fate surely worse than death. As I ran, the rocks seemed to protrude less and less, retreating back into their stoned surfaces as the walls of the cave moulded into a rounded form. I now found myself in an area more familiar to me, for it was purely the product of man. I listened. The footsteps were no more, yet I felt no less uneasy. Before long, I had found myself knee-deep in a malodorous sewage tunnel. Large, cylindrical, and interconnected tunnels stretched indefinitely. Pipelines and brick layered the walls and the ceilings. The restless industrial maze that man had created. I recall feeling languid. My movements had become dulled. I felt the entrenchments of vile matter course through my blood, oppressing each step I took as I waded through what felt like tar. It was after I felt I had walked for eternities that I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Rejuvenated in that moment, I began to sprint towards the light. In that moment of the purest ecstasy, I had not realized that each step I took blackened the already murky waters, and that it now reached my waist. It crept up my body ever so slowly. Its aqueous claws threatened to subdue me into its turgid mightiness. As my feet left the ground in which I had been walking on, I began to swim with a fervent terror. I thrashed and struggled, yet it was inevitable that I would sink, for I was but a germ in a colony of waste. I stopped fighting. Ceasing to move my limbs, I began to sink. I looked up in my idle state. The sight of the ceiling slowly diminished as I drifted deeper and deeper into its bottomless pit. I assumed a fetal position. I awoke from that tumultuous night in a dreary, panicked state. I had never been poised, but yet that night I was compelled to pray to God. Over the course of a few days, I had developed into a surreptitious insomniac. It began to trickle into my everyday life and inevitably would take a toll on my well-being. My thoughts would often stray to that very man, occupying my every thought. At home I would see him barely perceptible outside of my peripheral vision, a towering, indefinable mass lurking, as if he awaited a moment of weakness, able to strike at any moment. Very soon I had been let off work as I was deemed unfit to continue working. An inquiry was made on my mental well-being. Of course, nothing ever came of this, as I, for the most part, kept to myself. The visions inched closer. Seldom did I sleep in the wake of madness, his imposing presence making itself known at every turn. One night I got up to go to the bathroom. The warm fluorescent light reflected off of the bathroom tiles, producing a sickly yellow that induced a sulphuric dreariness in me. I dared not look up at myself, for surely my harsh dealings with the woes of paranoia had transfigured me into a grotesque caricature of myself. As I looked down, my gaze was met by the hideous countenance of a corpse. It had been him in that drain, that illusory fiend that appeared to me that rainy night, entombed within the confines of my bathroom drain. His eyes were now two sunken black holes. One felt that they could plunge into its depths. I screamed and bolted out of the room. I left my apartment and kept running, never looking back for a second. In that state of abject horror and adrenaline, I felt alleviate somehow. My earlier trepidations had formed into a hypogonic elation. Unsure if I was fully conscious, yet more alive than I had ever been in my waking hours, after running aimlessly that night, by some miracle of predestination, I'd found myself in a peculiar place. I stood staring blankly into the vacuous mouth of the behemoth before me. The entrance to large, cylindrical sewage tunnel opened its jaws like that of a giant basking shark. It was my own foolishness that had led me to that place, for I secretly yearned for such. I obeyed my drives and entered the edifice of its inescapable bowels. I had found myself knee-deep in a malodorous sewage tunnel, large, cylindrical, and interconnected tunnels stretched indefinitely. Pipelines and brick layered the walls and ceilings, the restless industrial maze that man had created. I recall feeling languid. My movements had become dulled. I felt my entrenchments of vile matter course through my blood, oppressing each step I took as I waded through what felt like tar. This time, however, no light at the tunnel appeared to me, only the same unflinching darkness which doomed me to ruin. Escape seemed futile, for it pulled one further into its depths. I could not even remember if there even had been an entrance, for an entrance would imply an exit. Yet every pathway led into a different desolate area of sewage, never bearing any possibility of escape. No hymn or prayer may save me now as my soul is doomed to drift into a catatonic plight. My blood remains the only ink readily available to me. If we were to suppose that my mad writings were not lost, these bloody parchments of mine will remain the remnants of a time long gone. No one will be able to hear the fervorious tremor of my voice, for these sewers have stripped me of every vocal cord I had, any fight I had in me. I applaud the cretin that I met that day, for he had unknowingly become my Mephistopheles, a deviant of callous trickery. I wonder how many of them reside under the earth as I do, oblivious to mankind, sheltered from the lunacy such evolved men would bring. I believe I have reached the end of my account, so I feel it is my duty to inform any such unfortunate reader who may have come across these ravings of mine. Please be wary of the caveman, for his archaic flame always burns anew, quoth his prey, lured into the depths of hellish futility.
Hunting for Bigfoot. It was a Saturday morning when we had gone hunting for Bigfoot. The sky was overcast and grey, matching my mood perfectly, until we pulled over on the side of the old highway. The moment I popped the trunk and slid my hand over the wooden stock of my grandfather's rifle, though, my focus returned. I cocked the gun in sync with the spark of rage that flared within the depths of my belly. I looked to my brother Darren, who had also taken his weapon in hand, though with noticeably lesser intent. Come on, Darren. Enough sulking. You know what we need to do. Yeah, I know. He slammed the trunk shut and slung his bag over his right shoulder, keeping the rifle in both of his hands as he trudged past me towards the woods. Let's just get this over with. His exasperation was on full display. It sickened me. I simply followed along, having nothing left to say. Our boots squished in the softened surface of the forest floor, following the ATV trail deeper into the wild. The smell of wet grass and rotting logs was overwhelming, only to become sickening once it meshed with the stink of the swamp. But the smell would not deter us. We followed the swamp's edge, keeping the water to our right. Our eyes, however, were constantly surveying the area, searching for any signs of the ancient ape, or perhaps signs of its victims. There wouldn't be anything left of Dad. We'd already been out here countless times before, ever since the creature had taken him. Darren still refused to believe his brother, let alone his own eyes, but I knew what we had seen that day. A dad taking his two preteen sons on a fishing trip, having a great fun in the sun. It was the first time I had ever actually caught anything, which was still better than how Darren was doing. At one point, my kid brother started crying after one fish broke his line, and Dad had to console him. And as he did that, the shadow came. I watched it approach from its cover amongst the tree line, slow but steadily. When I pointed it out to him, Dad took a quick look before telling us to start walking away from the bear. Backwards with care, we all had our eyes on the shadow, so we were all able to see when it dropped to all fours and began sprinting for us. Dad told us to run back to the car as he pulled out his pocket knife, trying to stand tall and wide as he could do to scare it off. Darren was crying in fear, so I had to pull him away, but that didn't stop me from watching. Soon enough, the beast was in front of my father and back to standing on two legs, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear. If anything, it was a roided out gorilla that hadn't skipped leg day. It blotted out the sun with its stature, looming several feet over our dad. Darren and I had gotten to a safe distance where the beast didn't see us, but I could sure see them. I wanted to cry for Dad to run, to scream at him to get out of there, but my throat closed up, choked up by fear as I watched him stumble back. The knife dropped out of his hand, and the monster roared in his face, revealing a set of flesh-ripping fangs. After that, my eyes were transfixed on the monster, beating my father into a bloodied pulp. Unable to avert my gaze, it swung his body around wildly, slamming my father against tree and rock and ground alike. I would have assumed that the thing was using my dad as a plaything if it had not been for the pure feeling of rage that it exuded. Even to us, up on the hill, my throat finally began to muster some small short cries as I witnessed the beast dragging the corpse back to wherever hellhole it called its home. I distinctly remember the size of its hand, almost large enough to wrap around the entire length of my father's lower leg. The only leg that was left anyways. A good while after they had disappeared, I led Darren back to the car, and with snot and tears dripping over the screen, I called Mom. I was finally able to utter something that resembled a word. Help. The police found the leg that the beast tore off a few days later, floating in the swamp, and the footprints fit the proportions too. But the police ruled that we had just seen a bear attack, and that's the footprints. Size was due to the bear's paws spreading out in the mud. I didn't buy it. I never would. And now, as a grown man, I returned to these woods every weekend to get revenge. Looking down at the ground, I stopped dead in my tracks. Darren, over here. My younger brother came sprinting back to me as I grinned and pointed. The same enormous footprints we'd only seen on a few occasions. What did I tell you? Jacob, they're the same prints from before. We've been over this. Those are... Don't. "Don't say it again," I growled. Darren was far more willing to just conform to whatever the nice police officers told him, because it was easier to listen. It was easier to just pretend that what happened was something normal, and not our father being murdered by a Sasquatch. Do you see the pattern of the pads? This is not a bear's foot, and it ain't one of our boots. That's the footprint of our Bigfoot. Darren just sighed and stood up. "Come on, let's just lay the traps already. And you're on your first watch. It's way too early for me to deal with your crazy mess." Grumbling, I pulled my pack off and ruffled through its contents until I found the jaws. In one swift but heavy motion, I tossed my bag over towards my brother, which contained our leg traps. He cried out as the steel slammed against his shin. "Ow! What is wrong with you?" Darren always was an infant, weak. It was for that very reason I dragged him out here each weekend, hoping that seeing the beast and confronting it would toughen him up and finally give us closure that we desperately needed. "Hey, you asked for them." A rumble sounded through the trees. We both instantly grabbed our rifles and began scanning our surroundings, trying to catch any kind of movement. Plap! My guard only began to lower as a raindrop crashed into the right lens of my glasses, warping half of my vision heavily. "Just thunder," I murmured, putting my rifle down to clean my glasses. "Prep the traps and come back over here quickly. We'll only be out here for a little bit today, I guess." Darren just groaned and snatched up the trap, storming away from me, with my vision fixed for the moment. I inspected my rifle and began to load it. If we were going to come across Bigfoot today, it'd have to be soon. It wouldn't be caught wandering around in a storm. The creature was smarter than that. I watched as Darren's figure grew hidden amongst the thin trees, wandering along our pre-established boundary to set the traps. Today we were trying cow liver as bait. We had been rotating the meat to see if any of them would have a better chance of attracting it. Darren thought it was just an expensive waste. But after just trying venison for 2 years straight with no results, something needed to change. By the time Darren was returning to our lookout spot, a thin mist had begun to fill the forest. The cold pierced through my sweater, so I was forced to zip up my puffer coat to keep warm. When he arrived, he tossed my bag back at me and plunked himself down with his back turned to me. I could hear the crinkling of his morning breakfast bar and groaned. "You should be ready to kill that thing at any moment, not snacking. You're completely deluded, you know that." I didn't bother responding. Darren's mind was well made up at this point, and no amount of convincing or conversation would change it. Only the stone-cold corpse of the Sasquatch would make him see the truth now. For a moment I wondered
what Sasquatch meat would taste like to myself. The rumblings of thunder grew more consistent, and the mist had thickened. As we sat and waited, I was constantly having to wipe my glasses clean to remain vigilant, now blinded from water and fogging alike. After a little while, it was my turn to check on the traps. Brushing off the mud and leaves, I trotted through the brush, checking all the traps' positions, and as usual, Darren had completely mucked up all the placements. The lazy prick. So it was left to me to adjust them, moving them to spots that were slightly more hidden, so it wasn't blatantly obvious to the beast that it was being hunted. Muttering under my breath, I fixed each trap and moved on until the fourth trap of 5. The cow liver was not there, but the trap had not been closed shut, and the mud around the area was stomped and squished in various ways. The tingle of anticipation began to hurry my heartbeat, and I just stared at the device before calling out to Darren. "Hey Darren, you put livers on all the traps, yeah?" "Yes, Jake. I don't need your..." Thunder rolled again, but I had heard enough from my brother to get my answer. I began to make my way back to our outpost, walking backwards at first and surveying my surroundings. Once I was certain no eyes were watching me from beyond my view, I raced back to my brother and slid back beside him. Darren began shouting at me and demanding to know what was wrong, but I shushed him quickly. "Something took the liver on trap 4, I whispered, trying to hide my simultaneous excitement and fear. "So?" "It could have been some hungry bear for all we know, or a coyote, or whatever kind of animal among the hundreds that live in the woods." Darren was expressing annoyance with me, but he too was whispering. He had to, in part, believe that something was out there. I ignored his sentiments and grinned. "We gotta set up the tarp. We aren't going anywhere." We always made our site near a trio of young trees, shaped in a triangle, so we could easily create a tarp roof if the weather was not in our favour. And with the way that rain was beginning to cut through the fog, we decided to do just that. Beneath the tarp we continued our watch as water poured down before our eyes. Darren continued to whine that we should leave before we got struck by lightning, but I refused. The missing meat from the trap was already a sign that we needed to stay. In all of our time out here, only twice before had the meat been taken, and both times the trap had been shut. But we had never caught anything actually stuck in the traps. The beast mocked us, taunting us, wanting us to know that it was not just some random creature of the woods. It was greater than that. Time passed, the sky boomed above us. I gave myself but a moment to imagine that we were soldiers in Vietnam, hunkering down in the rain, but staying awake in case of a sudden enemy attack. I was pulled from the thought by a hand on my shoulder. Whipping my head around, I saw Darren starting to get up. "I need to stretch my legs. Gonna go check the traps." He started to leave, but turned back to look at me. We really should get going soon. This weather is awful. I shook my head without a word. Darren opened his mouth to say something else, but gave up and left. Huddling with my rifle, I shivered profusely in my cold, wet clothing. My hand was nearly frozen in place. Clasped around the barrel, I could feel my knuckles locking up in their sockets. Crash! The crack of lightning erupted nearby. I witnessed a flash from between the trees. The rain began to fall faster, hitting the leafy forest floor like bullets from the heavens. I could feel my senses all beginning to be overwhelmed by the sensations of the wild. Ah! A scream. I pivoted in its direction and readied my rifle. It sounded like Darren, but I couldn't see him between the rain and my fogged glasses. I wiped them off quickly, then looked again. There, it was, still blurry, but there was no denying it. A large black figure, raising its hand above its head and slamming down into the ground, attacking my poor brother, who was likely being beaten on the ground by it. Out of my sight. I was not going to let Bigfoot take another member of my family. The rage was ignited. I ripped a bullet off my belt and slammed it into the chamber, then shoved the bolt forward and took my aim. The beast was still slamming at the ground. Maybe the trap had caught it in place. There was no time to waste. The crosshairs were aligned with its chest. I pulled the trigger without hesitation. The gunshot echoed through the trees, louder than any thunderbolt had previously, and the bullet was a direct hit. I watched with widened eyes as the Sasquatch fell, clutching its chest before crumbling slowly to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, slipping and tripping in the mud and grass. My fingers screamed out in pain as I pulled myself past multiple trees. Hurting from the cold, I kept the gun close to my side, in case the job wasn't done yet. But finally, after all these years, I had finally struck back and avenged my father. I had slain Bigfoot. When I reached the spot where the Sasquatch had fallen over, however, there was no beastly corpse, no massive muddy footprints imprinting its last path. I found only my brother, collapsed face first into the mud, with his blood mixing in to form a foul sludge beneath his body. Echoes on the radio. Back when I lived in my hometown, I would often go for late night drives on the back roads. Whenever I felt restless, the town was small, surrounded by forests and farmland, so once you got away from the main street, there was hardly any traffic, even in the day. Once night fell, the roads were totally dead, the perfect place to go to think things over or just step back and be alone. I used to turn the radio on low scroll through the local channels, or just let my thoughts mull in my mind to the background of the engine humming. The last time I went out on one of these drives, however, it ended up giving me a lot more to think of than I had hoped for. At the time, I was dealing with some personal stuff that I'd rather not admit to people that I don't really know, but I hoped that once I got out on the road alone, I would be able to start setting things straight in my mind. I pulled out onto one of the smaller highways right around the time that the sun was setting and turned on my radio to scan through the local stations. As usual in this area, most of them came in with some interference, a trade-off when you live in more secluded parts of the country. The static was even worse than normal, and having a car with a pretty weak antenna, that was really saying something. I turned the dial back to off and decided that tonight I could get along with just the road noise for company. It was a nice night, and I had left earlier than I typically did, so I ended up straying pretty far from the customary back roads and ended up in an area I wasn't familiar with. This didn't really concern me, as I have a pretty good sense of direction, and there was lots of gas still in the tank. I turned the radio back on in order to see if there were some better stations around these parts. Flipping through them got me some of the same stations as earlier, but even more garbled than before, as well as one or two new god-awful pop country stations that seemed to be coming stronger than the rest. I kept scrolling through white noise until I came upon a pretty clear signal that sounded like a DJ talking in between tracks. Hopeful that I finally found a tolerable station, I waited to see what song he would play next. He talked for a bit how he would be getting to some new tracks later in the night, but first he had some things he wanted to talk about. He launched into a full-scale deconstruction of the court system. How bullshit it was that someone could be accused of something with little to no evidence. He began naming off dozens of cases of wrongful convictions and explaining about how even if you were proven innocent, you aren't free and clear from legal costs or the disdain of your peers. I hadn't been listening to the station very long when the white noise started to crowd the signal, but it was still strong enough that he was mostly audible. You know, an accusation like that doesn't exist in a bubble. Rumours spread, and there is no such thing as presumption of innocence in the court of public opinion. But hey, that's just the way it is. As static started to take over his voice, I remember hearing him say, "You never know who really is there for you when you need it, and sometimes it turns out that there's nobody." Right around then I lost the signal completely. It took me a few minutes to find a road to turn onto to get back in range, and slowly the signal started to grow stronger. It only could have taken a few minutes to get back onto a parallel road, but in that time he had gotten much more agitated and frantic, the first thing that came across the speaker being a lemon station of his own isolation. Something along the lines of, hell, God didn't make man to handle things all on his own. It's even worse when you get a little taste of what it's like to count on someone, but to suddenly find out that at the slightest provocation they turn tail and run. He went on like this for a while longer, and my interest changed from some minor curiosity about this guy to genuine concern. I knew nothing about him, and had only heard him speaking for a few minutes at most, but the inflection in his voice and what he was saying really drew me in. Meanwhile, he continued on his tirade. Fuck. Maybe they weren't in the wrong after all. Maybe I'm just such a problem to be around, and they just needed an excuse to leave. Probably would make it easier on everyone if they never had to think of me again. I knew that I had to try and find this guy, to talk him down, or at least understand what caused him to get to this point. Based on how quickly I lost and regained the signal, I figured that the broadcast had a pretty limited range, and it soon dawned on me that it must be the forest to my right, as I had been driving past the block when I first got within range, and turned back onto when I picked him up again. At the time I assumed that the broadcast must be one of those smaller private radio stations, and that he was working out of the plot of land I was driving past at that very instant. I figured there must be a driveway somewhere for him to have gotten a radio outfit into the woods, which made up the plot to the right of me, and I hadn't remembered passing by any obvious ones while on the other two roads, so I kept my eyes peeled for one on this side of the road. Meanwhile, the station had gotten disturbingly silent, with the once animated host not uttering a word. This worried me even more than when he had been frantic. Unsure of what this really meant, I started to speed up, now going well above the speed limit, desperately searching for a turn-off or opening where I could enter the dense forest. The static picked up again as I got further down the road, and as much as I hated losing his broadcast, I had no choice but to keep driving until I saw a turn-off. I nearly drove past it before I slammed on my brakes and made a hard right onto the overgrown potholed dirt road that led right into the heart of the woods. Soon after I got on the road, the signal came back. He was much more quiet and reserved now, and very far away from the microphone. He was nearly inaudible until I cranked the volume as high as I could. So, I hope you enjoyed this last broadcast from the Red Cabin Station, because I really fucking didn't. I'm sure it wasn't what you expected, but hey, that's life, ain't it? In the background I could hear something being moved around, like a desk or a chair being dragged across the floor. The last thing he said was, "Who am I kidding? It's not like anyone is really listening anyway." I heard a clattering, something big and heavy falling over, and the signal went silent. Not into static, but completely silent. It took a few very long minutes to reach the end of the dirt road. After things went quiet, it opened into a kind of semi-clearing with lots of brush and some short, stunted saplings. I could see nothing but woods surrounding me, with the exception of the occasional pair of headlights driving on the highway in the distance. There were no lights shining from a cabin's window, and no shadows in the woods that could even look like the outline of a building. I got out of my car to get a better look. Standing in the glow of my headlights, I circled the clearing. As I got to the far left of the clearing, I got a better look at one of the shadows I thought was just another tree, and as I closed in on it, I saw that it was the stump of a small radio tower, the type that old TV antennas would be mounted on. I could see now that it was badly rusted, with some pits so deep in the frame that they ran all the way through. Despite the condition of it, I couldn't help but feel vindicated that this could certainly have been where the signal could have originated. Spurred on by this, I ran across the clearing, looking for anything that could bolster this discovery. About halfway across, however, I tripped and fell flat on my face. When I looked back to see what had sent me sprawling, I could clearly see a fragment of concrete sticking out of the ground. I rose to my feet, and looking around I saw the outline of a concrete foundation for a small building or cabin. I searched the entire woodlot that night, desperate to find the broadcast station of the tiny radio channel and discover the fate of this strange narrator. In the end, there was only the foundation and a crooked antenna tower, and I had no choice but to get back in my car and take the long drive home. As I drove out the clearing, I noticed that the white noise had come back, and I left the radio off for the rest of the night. For a short time after, I asked around the area if there were any private radio stations out in the sticks, or if anyone knew of the broadcast. None of my friends had heard of any local independent broadcasters, certainly none by the name of Red Cabin Station. Undeterred, I asked my parents and their friends. A few remembered tuning into 8 illegal stations in their youth, and told me of the weird unlicensed music they heard presented by nearly deranged DJs, and how interesting it was to them at the time, but none had heard of the one I encountered, and most even seemed to be utterly bemused by the idea that there would be any around in modern times. The only time I got anything remotely close to closure, in my experience, was talking to the elderly clerk at the county gas station. He didn't know anything about the Red Cabin per se, but he expressed a great interest in my story. Once he heard the whole thing through, he relayed to me some folk knowledge. Radio waves didn't just fade once a broadcast finished. The energy from those transmissions would bounce around space. The more energy in the broadcast, the longer it would stick, just like an echo. These days, I don't listen to the radio often. The last thing I want to do is find another echo like that. Last Friday. I've heard of a place out here where I live. It's on one of the back roads of the Alaskan new growth forests, in one of these valleys. They say that if you drive down this road on a day when the sun is shining so brightly as to make everything appear black and white, then you might come across a girl walking along the side of the road. She is said to be easy to recognize because whether it is summer or winter, she is always wearing a heavy wool overcoat and a set of oversized headphones, like those big skull candy headphones you can find in the stores. According to this story, if you drive up alongside her and roll down the window, you might hear her singing the song some people around here say is Rezzo's Cerise, Gloomy Sunday. If you interrupt her asking the question before she's finished the song, it's said that her answer will be, I can't remember. And that in the next town that you enter, you will be arrested for the kidnap and murder of this girl. However, if you were to wait for her to finish and then ask the question, being, when did it last snow? And this is to be asked no matter what season it is, she will give you one of three possible answers. If she says Thursday, you will continue to drive ahead as if nothing has happened. But, though you will be able to see and control your actions, it will be through a thick fog, as if you were asleep. You will live out the rest of your life in this empty dream state, and when you die, your soul will be condemned to a black emptiness. If the answer is today, then you are far more fortunate. You will continue on to your destination without event, and upon returning home, find that your greatest wish has been realized. However, if her answer is last Friday, then may whatever entity controls our fates have mercy on you. You will vanish for over a year. No one will have the slightest clue where you have gone, and your family, in despair, will give you up for dead. Then on a Friday, during the following year's snow melt, your body will be found hanging from an old black spruce in one of these swamps. Your face will have been eaten away, and your body in such a state of decay that you'll only be identified by your dental records. Your spirit, however, will be trapped, forced to walk the road every day when the sun is so bright that everything seems black and white. How do I know this? I have never done this myself, only heard the stories, but I have also lived up here for most of my life, so I can tell you this honesty. 6 years ago, this entity was a little boy. Then they found my sister. The shaman. Many, many years ago, there lived a very powerful shaman. Many people went to see him, for he was able to summon the spirits of their dead relations from beyond the grave. These spirits would then possess him and converse with their living relations through him. At the same time, there was a very eminent doctor in the region who had great ambitions not only in the medical field but also in politics. He sought to be a community leader, and he wanted to lead the people through the knowledge and wisdom he had obtained from his overseas Western education. The doctor was appalled when he discovered his own wife was visiting this shaman in order to talk to the spirit of her dead grandmother when he scolded his wife and forbade her to visit the shaman again. He found that friends and relations of her inner circle would take her side and warn him against doubting the power of the shaman. Furious, he vowed to prove them all wrong. That night he drove over to the shaman's house, together with his wife and some friends and relatives. He instructed his wife and the others to remain in the car while he and his brother went to test the shaman's power in order to prove the hoax. He lied that his wife was dead and he wanted to speak with her spirit. The shaman, not knowing that this was the husband of one of his regular customers, went into the ritual of the trance. It was an elaborate ceremony, for this invoked the very guardian of the gate between the world of shadows and the land of the living. After half an hour or so, the shaman collapsed in exhaustion, having tried without success to summon the spirit. There were many others present in the house of the shaman, beside the doctor and his brother. The doctor gloated over the shaman's failure and denounced him as a charlatan to the others. He said people must never believe such superstitious nonsense again. At this point, the whole room was stunned by the sudden movements of the shaman. He sat bolt upright in a rigid lotus position and began to weep in a woman's voice. The cry was so eerie, even the doctor was afraid. What kind of trickery is this? The doctor stammered. What have you done? Said the wailing voice. Oh, what have you done? Because of the summoning, they have brought me into the shadow lands just for you. The doctor couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was his wife's voice coming from the shaman's lips. Reeling in horror, the doctor rushed out to the car, fearing the worst. He found his wife slumped in the car, dead. Those who were with her said she shrieked suddenly and died in an instant, just about the same time as he had heard the weeping voice. Can you help me find my cat? I was out one night in December, around midnight. It was terribly cold, being the day after Christmas. I sighed deeply, almost amused at seeing my breath. I was tired, walking home from my friend Ricky's house. We'd just got done eating a ton of snack food and playing Pokemon, battling over and over, like when we were kids. How I missed those days. I'm 17 now, and kind of a nerd. I don't have a lot of friends, but I cherish the ones I do have. I don't have a girlfriend, but do have a crush or two. Anyway, I loved taking walks at night. It was so quiet and peaceful. I also really loved the cold air caressing my cheeks and fingers. I sighed again, almost home. Just a block away was my house, where I lived with my mum and two bratty younger sisters of 15 and 10. Part of me didn't want to go home, worried Mum would catch me up late and scold me for being out alone. Suddenly, I saw her. She was pretty, kind of short, but not a child. She had wavy blonde hair and was wearing satin pants and a long blue tank top. As I got closer, I could see her face. Her pale skin was almost white as snow, with piercing green eyes. Her lips and fingers were blue. She looked very sad and very cold. I imagined it was because she was barefoot and had nothing on her arms. As I got about 3 feet away from her, she took a step towards me and said, in a chilling, soft, yet raspy voice, "Can you help me find my cat?" I shrugged and tried to smile. "Sure, where do you think he is?" She pointed to a truck parked in a driveway. I nodded and walked with her to the car. Before walking around it, I took off my jacket and offered it to her. "Here, you're gonna freeze to death." She smiled sadly, looking up at me. After a short pause, she whispered, "I already have." By then I was getting freaked out by her. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything. Plus, I could see her breathing. I put my jacket around her shoulders, and for some reason, I was relieved when it stayed there. I made my way around the car. Sure enough, there was a kitten underneath. I reached in and pulled him out. To his surprise, he must have been focused on her. He purred in my arms and eagerly jumped to the girl when he saw her. She smiled at me, joyful tears now cascading down her snowy beige skin. She grinned wide and scratched the cat's ears. "Thank you so much." I smiled back, glad that she was happy. She turned to walk, and it was in the direction I was heading in. I made conversation after a moment, briefly reaching over to pet the kitten. We talked about the weather, work, music, and the like. She was 17, named Hannah. She was out for a long time looking for her cat, freezing in the cruel December air. Of course, our talk was very short-lived, since I was close to home. "Jack," she said, "thank you so much for helping me." She grinned. "Of course," I said, blushing. She reached over and kissed my cheek. Her blue lips were like ice on my numb face. I shivered at the touch, though flattered that she did such a thing. I went to stammer a reply, but she had turned. Her words echoed in my head, and then I realized something. "Wait, I didn't tell you my name. How did you?" I asked, watching her walk away. She turned to look at me, smiled, and then vanished. Gatekeeper. Aliyah closed her sketchbook with a sigh and stood up, brushing dead leaves and pine needles from her jacket. She had completed the majority of the nature sketches she needed for class, and the saplings had served its purpose nicely. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and she didn't mind the time outside amongst the creaking trees. Her art teacher had assigned them 3 sketches for the evening, each to be taken from something different in nature. Alia had 2 completed, a rosebush, and now the burgeoning white pine. She didn't know what she wanted for her 3rd and final drawing of the afternoon, but she had time yet to wander in the woods, and was confident she would know when she saw it. Leaves rustled and crunched underfoot as she continued, returning to the old snowmobile trail she had followed out into the forest. The path always became a little hard to follow due to disuse as the seasons wore on through spring and summer, and would remain that way until the snows came. Maples, oaks, birches and beeches had shed most of their leaves and stretched skeletal arms towards one another, seeming to huddle in order to ward off the coming cold. The air had gained that distinct bite to it that comes with winter's approach. Still, the sun shone warmly through the trees, warming Alia's face. The woods were a beautiful place to be this time of year, and she drank in the life of the place with every breath. After a short while of hiking, Alia's eyes fell upon a fallen tree. It had long since begun to decompose, and a line of purple wildflowers grew atop it, the tree's death giving them life. She smiled. The flowers looked tiny, lavender-shaded trees, a forest within a forest, the woods in micro. It would do perfect for her 3rd sketch. Alia sat cross-legged in front of the fallen tree. She took her sketch pad and pencil from her jacket pocket, brushed her long hair out of her eyes, and began. It was at least 20 minutes later that she first caught the shape moving in the corner of her eye. She looked up from her sketch pad and saw someone moving along through the trees, appearing and disappearing behind them as he went. Their shoulders were haunched, their eyes pointed at the ground, yet they moved quickly, striding like they had purpose. Due to the distance, Alia could only discern that they were wearing a dark-coloured hoodie, with the hood drawn up over their head. Alia's gaze shot between the stranger and the fallen tree. Never had she seen another person out in the woods here, and so she immediately felt desperate to discover who they were and why they were out in the forest. They certainly didn't seem to be enjoying themselves, whoever they were. Her curiosity eventually got the better of her. She closed the sketchbook, returning both it and her pencil to her pockets. She had the shapes of the picture drawn out and could manage the detailing and shading by memory later on. She hurried after the haunched figure, crunching leaves as she went. As Alia drew near, the figure stopped and turned to face her. It was a boy, somewhere near Alia's age too, and fairly diminutive in stature. He looked vaguely familiar. She had probably seen him at school. The boy's face was shaded from the hood, but still she could tell that he had dark rings sweeping under his eyes. He stood silently, hardly seeming to breathe. With dark, wary eyes he watched her, his demeanour that of someone who has been accused of a horrible crime for which they have no alibi. "Hi," Alia finally managed, after standing uncomfortably before the boy for a time. In a voice barely audible and with hardly any movement of his lips, he gave a "hi" in return. The uncomfortable silence returned. Alia realized she would have to be the one to speak yet again. "My name's Alia. Haven't I seen you around school? What's your name?" "Alec," he replied slowly, but a bit louder than before. He fidgeted and, perhaps feeling warm, swept back his hood. Alia recognized him at once, or rather his hair. She remembered seeing his face around, and up until several months ago, his face had always been capped with a crop of light brown hair. The boy had obviously been going through something of a phase, though. His hair was dyed a silvery white. Alec quickly noticed Alia staring, and quickly pulled his hood back up as he averted his eyes. The boy looked frightened, like he thought Alia was going to hurt him. The fact alone made Alia feel guilty. When the boy made eye contact again, she flashed him a reassuring, questioning smile. Alec shifted nervously from foot to foot, but seemed to be a little more at ease. He returned a small, friendly, "Oh, so you're not going to hurt me," smile. "I'm doing some sketches for my art class." Alia drew her sketch pad halfway from her pocket to illustrate. "What brings you into the forest?" All of the improvements seen in Alec's demeanour vanished in a heartbeat. He returned Alia's quizzical look with a cold, icy stare. Without another word, he turned and began striding off the way he had been going. Alia took a few half-hearted steps after him. Immediately, Alec yelled over his shoulder, all of his vulnerable manner having evaporated, "Don't follow me." Alia was completely taken aback. She stood in shocked silence as Alec trudged away, shoulders hunched once more. Where could he be going that he was so secretive about? She chewed her lower lip as she stared after him. Her curiosity had always been able to get the better of her. She had gotten in trouble for that in the past. This time it seemed things would be no different. Once Alia was confident that Alec was far enough away that she could move without being heard, she began to follow after him. Wary of making too much noise, she tried to avoid dead leaves wherever she could. Several times Alec turned and scanned the forest behind him. Alia hid each time, and was each time sure that he would see her. However, her luck held, and after a while of hiking and hiding, Alec led her to a field. Alia stopped at the tree line, poking her head out from behind the reassuring cover of a large evergreen. The area wasn't a true field. It was circular, and not quite large enough to be called a field, but too large to be called a clearing too. Alec was walking toward two dark figures standing in the centre. Squinting, Alia saw they weren't figures at all, but a pair of stone columns, each about 6 or 7 feet tall, and made of dark basalt. The two cast long shadows in the sinking sun. Alia hadn't noticed the sun. It was low, too low, almost gone behind the trees. She would never be able to find her way back in the dark. Alia was a brave girl, but a strong feeling of uneasiness was rising inside her. Alec had his back to her now, and was crouching before the pillars. Alia had come this far, and there was a little point in turning back now. After all, it looked as if she might need the strange boy's help to escape from the forest. Maybe he had a flashlight in that sweatshirt of his. Leaving the tree line, Alia padded quietly up behind him. He hadn't noticed her yet, so she offered a quiet hello. Alec jumped up and whirled. Upon seeing Alia, his face flashed through a parade of emotions. Surprise, anger, and finally, fear. He didn't yell. Once again, he spoke quietly as a mouse. No, you're not supposed to be here. No one's supposed to be here. Not here. Not now. Not. He cast his eyes toward the sun. Only a tiny fringe of burning orange remained above the trees. Not now. The boy looked positively terrified. Before Alia could respond, he spoke again, this time louder, more frantic. You need to leave. It's not. Just go. You can't be here. He gestured wildly with his arms as he spoke. As he did, his hood slipped down, revealing his white head of hair. The last of the sunlight set it aflame. Alia stared at him, fear, curiosity, and confusion, all chewing at her. Alec, calm down. What's wrong? Why are you even here? Alec wasn't listening. His gaze was directed toward the western horizon. The last sliver of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, and the fire atop Alec's head was snuffed out. Too late. Please, if you go now, you still have a chance. Run, and whatever you do, don't look back. Fear and madness burned in his eyes. Alia regarded him with a completely confused but increasingly frightened face. Whatever it was Alec thought was going to happen, it could only be something horrifically terrifying. Alia could see the boy's emotions were no act. Alia had gradually been becoming aware of a low hum, beginning to fill the air. Both Alia and Alec froze and stood silent, listening. Alec turned, staring at the stones standing behind him. Rigid and terrified, he turned and slowly looked defeated, like a man walking to his execution, moved step by step to the stones. Alia was unaware that she had started moving backward, away from the bizarre scene unfolding in front of her. She wanted to run, knew she should, but some part of her wanted to see what happened next. The hum was growing, not even sounding like a hum anymore. It was more akin to a room full of whispers. Alec cast a final glance back towards her, sad and rueful. Before the two pillars, there was a circular stone set in the ground. Alec knelt down upon it, looking as if he was awaiting the headsman's axe. Darkness was creeping over the forest. Alec offered a final word. It's too late to run. If you run, they'll chase you. A shimmer appeared around him as the whispers intensified. It looked like the boy was enshrouded in a heat shimmer, like those seen over hot asphalt. His whole body tensed. The whispers were almost deafening now to Alia, who stood rooted to the spot. They were coming from everywhere, From nowhere, she dropped to her knees and clamped her hand over her ears. But the whispers didn't abate. A second sound joined the chorus of murmurs. It took Alia a moment to realise that the sound was Alec's screams. There was an almost electric sounding snap. Blackness seemed to consume all light, pulled between the pillars, and Alec slumped to the ground. Alia's ears popped, and a gust of putrid air hit her. It was cold and filled with the smells of rot and decay. Following the air from the liquid darkness came a flurry of dark leaves. One of them skimmed Alia's face, and her skin stung where it touched. She fell to the ground, curling into a ball, clenching her eyelids tight together and keeping her hands over her ears. She had already seen too much. She knew she didn't think she could bear to see what came next. The air breezed around her, still filled with the smell of decomposition. She could feel them streaming out of the black, flowing out into the world. She could feel them standing over her, watching, puzzling. Only once did her eyes betray her, and Alia took a glance. Shadows, thick and dark like acrid smoke, dancing in the wind, flowed around her. Shapes surrounded her, horrible shapes of things that couldn't exist. Their words filled her head, though she understood not a word. They spoke in tongues, never meant to be heard by humans, unpronounceable, foul languages. Alia tried to tell herself it was all a dream, and that it would all vanish soon and be replaced by the warm safety of her bed. She tried, but her mind couldn't seem to form a cohesive thought. She knew only terror. The last thing Alia remembered before blacking out was the cold. It seeped into her, stealing her warmth until she had no more to give. Alia awoke to a bleak morning. She found herself in the large clearing still, her face pressed upon frost-coated blades of dead grass. Every bone in her body simply felt weary, almost incapable of movement. A thin coat of frost had formed across her, and everything else. It was a struggle drawing herself, shivering, to a sitting position. "You're awake." Alia found Alec sitting with his back against one of the black pillars. His face looked gaunt, more drawn and weak than he had been before. His hair was whiter than she could have believed. What happened?" Alia managed shakily. Alec for a long time simply looked at her, fixing her with a sad, empty gaze before replying. "If they want to come through, they need someone to open the door for them. I was unlucky. They chose me. If I don't do this, one will eventually find their way through, and..." His voice trailed off. "They take a lot of energy," he added. He gestured at Alia's head, and his sorrowful look deepened. "And I wasn't the only one who helped them last night." Alia took a lock of her hair and held it before her eyes. It was completely white. my one and only experience. Posted by CMC335. This story happened about a year and a half ago. I have only ever shared this story with one other person, the other person who is actually in this story. A little about me. I have a formal education in the hard sciences, and I am halfway through a Doctor of Medicine degree program. So those are the lenses through which I see the world. This makes me a natural skeptic on most things. I firmly believe in the existence of extraterrestrial life because the vastness of the universe makes it a mathematical certainty. But I am far less convinced on the subject of UFOs, although there are a number of well-documented events that keep me from dismissing them outright. This story has nothing to do with aliens, though at least I don't think it does. I guess I only mention it for the purposes of demonstrating that I keep an open mind on things, but that I still need to see at least some sort of suggestive evidence. I am a huge fan of the paranormal as a genre. I find the stories and media fun and entertaining. I like being scared, and I enjoy the experience of reflecting on what if. But it's always been just that to me, a genre of entertainment. Then this happened, and I still can't explain it. My fiance and I grew up and live in a small city in New England. Honestly, it's really only a city by definition. It's bigger than your average New England town, but it's far more suburban than your average city. The house my family has lived in since I was 2 is located on the outskirts of this city. I am now almost 30, and although my fiance and I live in an apartment below her mum's place, I still keep a lot of my stuff there at my old house, including my motorcycle. When you pull out of the driveway and go one way, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to get into the city proper, but if you go the other way, it takes about 2 minutes to hit farmland. Heading towards the farms, you end up on a road called Pine Hill Road. On this road is a very old cemetery with gravestones that date as far back as the 1700s. The cemetery encompasses a square plot of land bordered on 3 sides by trees and by Pine Hill Road on the 4th. The official name of this cemetery is Pine Hill Cemetery, but everybody in the area calls it by its other name, Blood Cemetery. It is allegedly one of the most haunted cemeteries in New England. The name derives from the Blood family burial plot, located more or less in the center of the grounds, and is where most of the alleged activity arises, tangibly. The blood headstone is engraved with the image of a hand, and it is said that during the day this hand points upwards towards the heavens, while at night it points down towards the ground. It is also said that the ghost of Abel blood roams the grounds. It is illegal to enter a cemetery at night here, and the police do patrol this area because of how frequently people try to go in at night to see for themselves. I personally have never actually been inside the grounds, day or night, not even during the experience I'm about to describe. By the way, I've used the real name of the place. Feel free to Google this cemetery all you want. That way you will know I'm talking about a real place with real stories attached to it. What I am about to describe is not a creepypasta. This really happened to me. I've driven past this cemetery a million times before, day and night, and not once have I ever seen or experienced anything out of the ordinary. That is, not until one night last fall. It must have been around late August or early September 2017, when summer was on its way out and fall was just starting to let everyone know it was on its way. It was late and dark one night when my fiance and I were out for a ride on my motorcycle. We love riding around this area because there is little traffic. The roads are just windy enough to make it fun, and the farms are beautiful. We were riding up Pine Hill Road and were just beginning to pass Blood on the left, as we've done so many times before. Going about 30 miles per hour, it must only take 3 to 5 seconds to pass the whole property, but this time something very strange happened to me. Time appeared to slow down when something red reflected across the visor of my helmet. I turned my head to the left, and this is what I saw. Up in a tree just along the left border of the cemetery was a floating orb of the brightest red light I have ever seen. So bright it was that its center was white. Orb isn't really the right way to describe it, because it wasn't just a sphere of red light. It looked like it was oozing and dripping, like it was made of plasma. The best way I can think to describe it is that it looked like the tip of a signal flare when it's held off the ground. It was that bright, and it was oozing like the tip of a flare, but it was not shooting out from anything like a flare does, where a flare has a sort of elongated shape from the sparks shooting out of the end. This was circular, and unlike a flare, there was no visibly physical object from which this drippy, burning orb emanated from. It just was. It was bright, and it was oozing, and it was dripping, and it was floating up in a tree. I really can't underscore enough just how bright this thing was to me. Then I noticed the rest. Moving around this red orb was a set of hands. I didn't notice them at first because of how bright the orb was and how dark the wood was, but as my eyes began to focus somewhat, I realized that there was something else in the tree with the orb, and it looked like it was actually conjuring the orb. The thing was humanoid looking, but it didn't look human at all. It looked like a scrawny and lanky E.T. phone home sort of thing, with nubby joint fingers and features, but with scrawny limbs. Its face was long, narrow at the top and bottom, but wide in the middle. It was bumpy. It was a face unlike any human face I've ever seen before, and I've seen a lot of deformed faces. Lepromacious faces, hypoplastic faces, coarse faces, faces without calvaria. Hell, I've even seen a real cyclops. Yes, cyclopses really do exist, and it's actually quite a sad thing, because cyclopia results from a condition that also prevents the brain from dividing, and the baby is usually stillborn. This thing's face looked like it was from hell. Its skin looked dark brown, and it appeared to be wearing some sort of baggy looking cloak. Its legs were crossed, its hands circling around this extremely bright oozing red orb, and it was hovering a few inches over a branch in the tree. Passing the cemetery on my motorcycle that night felt like the longest 3 to 5 seconds of my life. As we came to the other end of the cemetery, time appeared to resume itself as normal. I looked back over my shoulder, and it was gone. I looked back again, still gone. Twice more I looked back, twice more, it was nowhere to be seen. I immediately pulled over, and my fiancée asked me what was wrong, because she knows I never pull my bike over to the side of the road unless something is up and I have to, especially when it's dark, and especially not on these windy roads where people tend to drive like a bat out of hell. I can't blame them, these roads are fun. "Did you see that back there?" I asked her. "See what?" she asked. "That red light we passed back at the cemetery just now." "Red light?" she asked, a little confused. Turns out she hadn't seen a damn thing. Nothing. I explained to her what I had just seen, or experienced, or whatever it was that happened. She believed me, noting how I looked visibly disturbed by something. But whatever that something was, she hadn't seen any of it. It was dark, and we were moving, so normally I wouldn't have been so surprised by her not seeing something like a figure up in a tree we'd passed, but that orb of light, it was just so damn bright. There were no cars around, no houses from which a porch light could have been peering through those particular trees. There were no lights in the sky, no planes or helicopters around, and no explanation as to why only I saw this. I've never been diagnosed with mental illness, and I don't have a substance abuse problem.
and I certainly wouldn't have myself and the mother of my future children together on a bloody motorcycle if I was high or drunk. I've never had a seizure or been told that I've had seizures. I've never had hallucinations, and I've never experienced anything like this before, or anything like it again since. I've driven past blood numerous times since then, and every time it's just been its normal, old, sleepy self. Edit. The story happened now about 3.5 years ago, still vivid in my memory, and my fiancée is now my ex. He became real, posted by Deadly Demon Dreams. I don't know where to start from. I'm still in shock for what happened yesterday. I'll start with the context. After having reoccurring dreams about a demon, weird things started happening around me. Strange whispers at night, doors opening and closing. So it basically led me to believe I was being haunted. But they were just dreams, right? Exactly. Nothing else could happen. I was so wrong. Yesterday, the same demon that was haunting me came to my school. It may sound crazy, but he is real. He sat next to me. He didn't speak, but he was staring at me constantly. And with the mask, it was impossible to decipher what expression he was making. His blue eyes pierced my soul right through. It had a horrible feeling, the kind of feeling you get when you have seen hell. It was pure evil. He looked like any other teen. He looked normal and wore normal clothes, and that only made things more disturbing. The craziest thing happened when it was break time. He approached me and told me, "We need to talk." I internally said, "Nope, nope, nope," and tried to flee, but he took my hand, and it felt like I put a fork inside an electrical outlet and then grabbed it. He electrocuted me, and I literally screamed. He let go and glanced at me one last time before running away. I was so confused and scared. I didn't know what to do. Today, he didn't show up, and none of my classmates seemed to notice it either. I asked them, but no one remembered him. They didn't even know a new classmate was coming in. I told them he came yesterday, but they told me that they didn't notice anything. He just vanished. Why is this happening to me? I think something's following me and I don't know what to do. Posted by Acceptable Cup 4251. Something has been tormenting me since I played with a Ouija board. When I, female 19, was 14, I was sent to a boarding school a couple of hours away from my house. I actually really enjoyed it, and I thought living in a house full of my best friends was the best thing ever. I spent about 3 years there. When I was 15, in year 10, I stayed in one of 4 dorms in the house, being D dorm. Now there was a rumour that D form was haunted because of lights that would flicker and things of that sort, but nothing ever remotely extreme, and frankly I still didn't believe in any sort of paranormal activity, so the rumours went completely over my head. My friends alike. One day though, I overheard a group of my friends doing something in the room next to me. The walls between rooms didn't reach the ceiling, and so you could hear everything throughout the dorm most of the time. I went to investigate what my friends were doing and found that one of my best friends, Brittany, had brought a Ouija board along with her and was playing it with a group of our friends. I was somewhat fascinated, since I'd heard about it when I was really young, but never actually had the opportunity arise to see one in action. So there I am, watching and bantering with my friends as they played it, along with my friend Jess, who was spelling out on the notes of her phone each thing that the board was saying. The girls were asking it things like their birthdays, things like that. At one point, the girls asked me to get a student that none of us knew, so I went and invited one of the Chinese exchange students to come into the room. This was someone none of us had spoken to. The girls asked the Ouija board her birthday and were pretty shocked when the board gave them a birthday which the student confirmed as hers, since none of us had been friends with her. After that, everyone decided to stop playing. That is, everyone except for Brittany, who invited me to play it with her. God, I wish I never touched that thing. But I agreed, and so we continued to play with it, just Brittany and I in the room alone, with Jess, who was still writing out the letters. I was the one orchestrating the session, asking simple questions like, is anything here with us? Give us a sign if you're here, etc. After receiving yes, but no spooky sign, I asked the entity what its name was, to which the planchette began to go back and forth spelling Z-O, 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 Z-O. Brittany and I had no idea what this meant at the time, so we weren't exactly moved by it. That is, until Jess googled it, and without telling us what came up, ordered us to stop playing at that second,
We took our hands off and didn't say goodbye. Jess revealed her phone screen to us, and to our shock, it was a reference to the name of a supposed demon, Zozo, which gained notoriety lurking on Ouija boards, and had even had a movie made about it. We were creeped out, but nothing too crazy. Every night for the following 3 weeks, Brittany and I both woke up every night at 3 a.m. feeling strange, and we're both having horrific nightmares. This continued for exactly 3 weeks, and started and stopped for us both on the same days. After the nightmares stopped, I didn't pay much mind to what had happened, as demonic energetic attachment was the last thing on my mind really, and just put the strange dreams and awakenings to anything else subconsciously, I guess. For the following year, her and I both didn't experience anything out of the normal. That is, nothing I registered as strange anyway. After a year, I moved away to Europe, and this is where the activity peaked. We moved into a modern but old house. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary with the house, but pretty quickly I began feeling strange, occasionally feeling watched pretty intensely, things moving on their own in front of me, seeing shadows in the corner of my eyes, doors slamming, the attic lights switching on and off when the door was locked, hearing knocks from the attic, feeling a presence go from the room I was in into the stuffed bear next to me, extremely intensely. My grandma's old wind-up music box playing on its own. Just an all-round feeling of just something being off. In general, the activity would only happen when I was alone, and I would tell my family, but they would just brush it off as all in my head, other than my sister, who also told me she felt weird in the house. That is, until one day where my mum called me into her room to show me one of her coat hangers swinging back and forth wildly. This opened her mind ever so slightly, but she continued to brush it off. As time went on, the activity became more and more intense. Looking back, there was actually some really freaky shit going on in that place. I recall one time I was home alone for a few weeks, where I was sitting in my bed watching TV at around 2 in the morning when I felt something sit on the end of my bed. The blanket moved, and there was an impression where this weight had come onto. On top of this, I could feel something staring straight at me. One of the most unsettling things that happened to me in that house, though, was an occasion where my big sister, who is my best friend, and I were hanging out in her room, where we always spent time together. When you walk into the room, directly opposite the door, leaning against the far wall, was a large, full-body mirror that we used to look at our outfits rarely ever getting close enough to touch, and always being able to see any marks on it, since it was the first thing you'd see when you'd enter the room. One night her and I were on her bed when she got up to go to the bathroom. Upon re-entering the room, my sister asked me, "You touched the mirror?" I said no, and my sister went pale and pointed at the mirror. When I saw it, my blood ran fucking cold. Right on the mirror was the biggest handprint I've ever seen in my life. This thing was roughly 35 centimeters long and was intact. You could see the mark of each joint of the fingers, and it was clearly not dragged or out there earlier, because, as I said, it's the first thing you see when you enter the room. I just about shat myself. We called for my mum to look at it, and she attempted to tell us that it was a dragged print from maybe an attempt to move the mirror, a claim we contested heavily. Another disturbing occurrence was a time where I had left an unfinished painting sitting vertically inside my room. However, the face of the girl in my painting was horizontal. When I woke up, the painting has a very clear tears running down the girl's face horizontally. I also had a vision kind of experience once when I was drifting off to sleep, where I saw a multitude, maybe 7 or 8, very demonic or spooky looking faces staring at me while I had my eyes closed. I never experienced anything similar before or after that, but I can still see the faces if I think of them. Many unexplainable things happened to me over the 3 years we lived in the house, and needless to say, it was a relief and a fucking half to have moved out, and to another country at that. For about 3 weeks after we moved out of the house, the strange feelings and occurrences subsided. That is, until one night where I woke up wide awake around 5 AM with a very intense feeling of dread. I was able to get back to sleep. The following night, my sister and I were sleeping in the same bed, and I had an extremely vivid dream of watching myself and my sister sleeping from the perspective of something that was in the top left corner of my room. Needless to say, I was pretty unsettled at the thought that this entity may had followed me. I don't know if it came from the board or if it came from the house, but recently it's getting worse, and it's getting worse quickly. I was at a girlfriend's house about a month ago with her and 3 dudes when I started talking about it. Upon talking about it, all doors in the house slammed except for one, the bathroom door, which was in view for all of us, which began to open and close wildly. This scared the absolute shit out of me, and Sarah could tell.
So she locked the door and we decided to stop talking about it. This is where things begin to get a little crazier, but I swear to God I'm not crazy. At least I'm pretty grounded and in touch with reality, and I really experienced this. It was the same night and I had gone to sleep downstairs at around 1:40 AM after a night of drinking and smoking weed, so I was pretty ready to sleep and should have had little issue with sleeping well. I woke around 3:30 feeling very, very uncomfortable. Sarah had actually told me the previous owner of the house had died in the room above me, which didn't help. I tried and tried to get to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I was about to drift off into sleep, it was like something jerked me awake. This was until about 6 in the morning, where I was trying to get to sleep, when I began to hear a sound which can be compared to the sound of rushing water or TV static in my left ear. This went on for about 3 seconds until the sound became background sound. So, to a somewhat raspy whisper-like voice which told me to come. This experience really freaked me out, and the occurrences have been getting worse since. Rather than feeling watched only at home or when I'm alone, it's begun to happen when I'm in public, in the car during the day and at night. I've also been seeing shadowy figures in my peripheral vision multiple times a day. I've also had the sensation of being touched by something when I'm alone at night, either on my phone, in bed, or trying to sleep. The feeling is like a kinda of staticky electric pins and needles-ish feeling, but it's very clear. I have felt it on my arms, my hands and thighs. I've felt it on my backside too. This thing will move things ever so slightly when I look at them. If I'm with people or do things like make lights go off, as I look at them when I'm with people, which I have assumed is it subtly making its presence known to me. About 2 weeks ago, I had a dream where I was getting into the car and I saw the same handprint from the mirror, only a lot bigger, on the seat. It grabbed me by the throat and I woke up. I guess I should have mentioned I've had somewhat bad luck after moving into the original house too, with my very tight-knit family completely falling apart, being sexually assaulted on 2 occasions, and the death of a friend. I don't know if these have anything to do with it, but I guess it's worth mentioning. I know it might sound crazy, but I really just don't know what to do at this point. It's freaking me out, and I want whatever the fuck this thing is to stay far away from me for good, and I don't know where to turn to for help. I'm not religious, but tomorrow I plan on going to a church to speak to anyone I can about it. The basement and the bedroom, posted by Maple Leaf Creations. The basement. This happened a few years ago, and I have never liked basements since. It was late in the day, sometime not long after dark, and I was doing my laundry. I had just moved the wet clothes into the dryer and was going upstairs. I turned off the basement light using the basement switch and looked over to the back corner. I always did this because I've always felt something down there, and I saw this black half ball shaped shadow figure that was about 2.5 foot in diameter and about 1.5 foot tall, come speeding towards me at the stairs. I ran upstairs and slammed the door as fast as I could. The reason I believe this is paranormal is because we smudged later that night, and I have never seen it again. The bedroom. This happened maybe a year before story 1. I lived in a duplex. Story 1, I lived upstairs, and story 2, I had moved downstairs. So same house, both stories. It was late at night and I was about to go to bed, and for some reason I decided to sleep facing the foot of the bed this time, closest to the door, and at this time I always slept with my door open. I was just ready to go to sleep when I looked out into my doorway, into the hallway, and I saw this black human-shaped shadow figure, about average height, standing in the hallway in front of my bedroom door. I closed my eyes because of pure reaction, and when I opened them again, it was gone. As I was writing this, I realized that this is probably the same entity as story 1. My Hat Man encounter, posted by Tuck Jess 40. I was invited here by an admin, so first of all, thank you. I have so many experiences to share with everyone, nearly 38 years worth to be exact. So, without further ado, here is one of the very first paranormal experiences that I remember. Enjoy. This happened one holiday weekend, the Saturday night before Easter. I was a 5-year-old little girl living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment with my mom, single at the time, and my brother 10 years older. I was sleeping on the bottom bunk of the beds my brother and I shared. I was alone in the room since my brother was staying with his father for
the holidays. I wake up and have to use the toilet. I go and do my business and wash my hands like a good big girl does. I loved being independent and doing things for myself, like any normal child at that age. Everything is normal until I walk back into my room. I see someone standing in the corner. I didn't blink, move, or even breathe. I just froze in such fear I couldn't think. This wasn't just a burglar or something. This figure was standing in the dark corner of my room. It looks like a man, only he is made out of complete shadow, like darker than the darkest black. I can make out the outline of his body shape and what looked like a trench coat and top hat. The clothes were also all shadowy like his body, no features on the face, like there is a ski mask over it without the eye and mouth holes. This isn't the scariest part though. What happened next has been ingrained into my memory so badly that I still recall even the smallest details of the experience. The figure raises one of his arms and points one long finger towards my bed. I had been standing next to it the entire time, having stopped to stare at the figure. Like most children, I had a favourite kiddie blanket that went everywhere with me. Mine was a Sesame Street blanket with a picture of Big Bird and Cookie Monster on it. This blanket, of course, was on my bed. When I turned to look what the figure was pointing at, I see that my blanket sort of melts. Then it morphs into thousands and thousands of bugs, spiders, cockroaches, centipedes, all the creepy crawly things you can imagine. They swarm and cover everything. Next thing I know, my mom is shaking me and I'm screaming and crying like I'm being murdered. All is back to normal and the figure is gone. The entire day after, I refused to allow my mom to take me off her hip. She had to carry me around like that for all of the Easter Sunday. I even refused to go hunting for Easter eggs with my cousins, and that is something I always enjoyed doing. Mom tells this story to family members every Easter holiday now, only she says I had a nightmare and woke up screaming about bugs. I know that isn't true. I know I was fully awake and I have never forgotten it. The paranormal is real. The madness overtook me. I couldn't stop it. Posted by Avenseyu. It started slowly, a few here and there. I didn't notice it until my brother Nathan disappeared. One day he was there
and the next he was gone. Nobody seemed to remember him except me. Everyone is disappearing, being forgotten. I am afraid I might be next. Why does nobody remember? I tried convincing my mom, my dad, my co-workers, anyone who would listen. I told them the day I told my mom went something like this. Mum, I have something to tell you. You won't believe me. I know, but you have to listen. You have to listen. Whoa, honey, slow down. What are you talking about? Of course, I will believe you. Mom, people are disappearing. Nathan disappeared. You have to have noticed, right? You have to have noticed he was gone. He was here, and then he just wasn't. He just disappeared into thin air. Nobody remembers him, but you have to, right? I pleaded with her, bordering insanity, mumbling incoherently. My panic was reaching a point that I could not come down from. What? Who is Nathan? One of your friends? What are you talking about? He just disappeared. My mum was looking at me with concern, like that look you would give an abandoned puppy. I hated it. She didn't believe me either. Of course she didn't. How could she? What do you mean? Who is Nathan? He is your son, my brother. You don't remember. I knew you wouldn't, but why? Why is this? I broke down into tears, panic getting the better of me. Sam, are you okay? Do you need to take a rest? Did something happen? What's wrong? She thought I was going crazy. I had to get away. I had to. There was no other option. I ran. I turned and sprinted out of the gaping front door. I stumbled down the stairs to the driveway, my mum calling after me with concern. After that, it sped up. People started disappearing faster than before. The rate of disappearances was exponentially rising. I was running out of time. I ran to my friend V's house and I told her, V, something is happening. People are disappearing and nobody is even noticing. What are you even talking about? She looked shocked. I pulled her aside and into her open garage. People are disappearing. Nathan, my brother, disappeared. I don't know who else, but we might be next. Are you okay? V looked at me with serious concern, but her gaze contained something different as well. She looked at me with that quiet glimmer of fear. She was scared of me. She thought I was crazy too. What did I expect? Really? She asked, the fire of worry burning in her eyes. Yes, you have to believe me. I looked at her, completely serious. I was dead set on figuring out what was happening here. Okay, I believe you. She still looked worried, but the fear washed out of her face. She tried to give a reassuring smile, but it was just weak. Really? You believe me? Relief and sanity washed over me. Finally, someone didn't think I was mental. Someone who thought I was sane. This was my chance to figure this out. Wait, what is happening to me? Sam, help, V cried out. She was starting to fade, just like Nathan had. Within seconds, she was gone. Tears welled in my eyes and fear overtook me. Fear that I might be going insane. Fear that I am all alone. Fear I will never see my friends and family again. I burst into her house and called out for her parents. No response. I ran outside and began knocking on every door in sight. No answer. I slammed on doorbells, kicked on doors, but it was no use. Everyone was gone, and there was nothing I could do. I was left alone on a desolate earth to rot, and nobody could save me. I succumbed to the madness and let it overtake me. No use in fighting. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. If you have any scary stories, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.